that actually matter to the city.
The fact that so many councils have taken them up on the offer and York Council have decided not to is a bit of a slap in the face for working families like ourselves.
City of York Council turned down this year's freeze and raised council tax by 2.9%. It's one of the first in England to say it'll do the same next year. Bills will go up another 2%.
If we're going to be able to protect the most vulnerable people, then we do have to have very small increases in council tax to be able to put that funding to the right people. Last year our increase brought in £2 million, where £1.5 million went to elderly people's care and £0.5 million went to look after children. That's exactly the right thing to do.
Julian Sturdy.
It's all been enough to make one York MP raise the matter with the man who met the Charltons.
Can my honourable friend agree with me that such a rise is apparently out of order? 2.9% last year was obviously under the threshold that the government allowed, which would have indicated that they would have had to have held a local referendum on the council tax rise. And yet again, 2% is again just under the threshold. If it went over 2%, then the local authority would have to hold a referendum. So York City Council, what they're doing is they're just holding the rises just below the level that would indicate that they would have to hold a local referendum in York.
For the Charlton family, struggling to make ends meet, council tax for them is going up.
Since the last election, there's lots more to do, that's clear, but I think we are certainly on the right track.
David Ward, can I press you for a figure? Marks out of 10 so far?
Oh, no, because I haven't read it, to be honest. I've been too busy, but it's work in progress. We're not getting there anywhere near fast enough in terms of the economy, and Hillary's absolutely right on that, particularly in terms of growth. I'm much more interested in what's to come, and in particular, I will judge the government on how well it deals with the huge issue of social care and the funding thereof. So judgment deferred.
And you're not going to tell us today that Bradford City only get to Wembley under a Liberal government, are you?
I am absolutely thrilled with this, and I will, of course, take credit for that along within the coalition government, but really full tribute to the fantastic efforts that have been made there at Bradford City.
We'll talk more in a moment, because we're asking, first of all, are taxpayers effectively being forced to pay twice for regeneration sites which are owned by the public sector? A BBC investigation has found that millions of pounds has been spent by local authorities buying up land which used to belong to the now defunct regional development agencies such as Yorkshire Forward. James Vincent has the story.
Barnsley, in the best possible way, it can sometimes look a bit grim. They've been waiting for redevelopment in the town centre for years. Key sites were bought by Yorkshire Forward with public money so that work could go ahead.
Barnsley's had a number of regeneration sites which Yorkshire Forward have been involved in. Out here in the east of the borough, in the Dearn and at Grindthorpe, Junction 36 at the M1, but the principal site and the main site we need for regeneration is right here in the town centre.
So the sites were already publicly owned by one government agency, but after Yorkshire Forward was closed by the coalition, their land was given to the Homes and Communities Agency, basically another part of the government. So Barnsley Council didn't bank on having to buy them again with £10 million of public money from their budget.
The government simply said, we want a market value. If you're not prepared to pay for it, we'll sell it somewhere else. That would have been a disaster for the scheme.
Councils thought that after the demise of Yorkshire Forward, they might be given these pieces of land, ready to be redeveloped, and then only pay for them when they were successful. That didn't happen, and the money has had to be found up front, much more of a risk. In York, the council has bought part of an old carriage works near the Railway Museum.
Well, I think it's reasonable to assume that land that's owned by the public, which it was through the government, would be passed on still to people and to the public after the demise of regional development agencies. I actually wrote to Vince Cable about this very issue, asking if that land could transfer over to our ownership, and I was written back and told no, and therefore we had to buy the land that we thought was strategically important for York.
The government would say that local councils don't need to own places for them to be successful. This one's owned by the Homes and Communities Agency. It's the Advanced Manufacturing Park on the border of Rotherham and Sheffield. Got Rolls-Royce moving in, diggers in the background, wind turbines working here, hundreds of jobs, and it's seen as the future of South Yorkshire's economy.
And this is another one of those sites, Tower Works in Leeds, run by the Homes and Communities Agency. They say it shows what can be done when they hold on to former Yorkshire Forward assets.
We've just recently opened this refurbish scheme, which has been a highly successful centre for digital and creative media. We've spent something like £5 million in the last 2 years actually completing the refurbishment of this project. When the decision was taken to abolish Yorkshire Forward, we were asked to take on responsibility for these remaining property assets. And some of those assets were sold off where there was no development planned in the immediate future. Other assets we're still working with councils jointly in partnership to bring forward the original schemes. But in some cases, and York and Barnsley are other cases, the local authorities decided they wanted to acquire those assets from us. The Treasury rules were clear that we wouldn't be able to give those assets away for nothing, so they had to be bought at the market value.
Some sites have been bought, others are still on the market. It'll be up to councils whether they want to gamble on taking responsibility for land in their areas. Barnsley hope their purchases will turn into a brand new town centre.
Hilary Benn, if I can come to you first, is it right that Labour councils in Yorkshire are spending millions of pounds buying land that's already publicly owned?
No, it isn't, and I can well understand why Steve Houghton and James Alexander are feeling really cross, because it was public money that bought these assets in the first place, and their budgets are being cut by the government, so they're being hit twice over. But I think the thing that really riles is that when it came to London, Boris Johnson was given the assets of the development agency there for free, whereas in the rest of the country, councils, if they want the land, are having to pay. So it's one rule for London and a different rule for everybody else. That is not fair, is it?
Nigel Adams, surely it's wrong that local authorities have to pay for this land in the current climate, isn't it?
Well, I think a lot of these assets will have been acquired a long time ago, many years ago, and there will, despite what's
Actually matter to the city.
The fact that so many councils have taken them up on the offer and York Council have decided not to is a bit of a slap in the face for working families like ourselves.
City of York Council turned down this year's freeze and raised council tax by 2.9%. It's one of the first in England to say it'll do the same next year. Bills will go up another 2%.
If we're going to be able to protect the most vulnerable people, then we do have to have very small increases in council tax to be able to put that funding to the right people. Last year our increase brought in £2 million, where £1.5 million went to elderly people's care and £0.5 million went to look after children. That's exactly the right thing to do.
Julian Sturdy. It's all been enough to make one York MP raise the matter with the man who met the Charltons.
Can my honourable friend agree with me that such a rise is apparently out of order? 2.9% last year was obviously under the threshold that the government allowed, which would have indicated that they would have had to have held a local referendum on the council tax rise. And yet again, 2% is again just under the threshold. If it went over 2%, then the local authority would have to hold a referendum. So York City Council, what they're doing is they're just holding the rises just below the level that would indicate that they would have to hold a local referendum in York.
For the Charlton family, struggling to make ends meet, council tax for them is going up again.
Mary Cray, surely in the current climate, councils should be doing all they can to freeze bills, not putting them up for hard-working families.
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, David Cameron made his promise that bills wouldn't rise, but then in the 2010 Comprehensive Spending Review, cut councils by 28%. He's announced another 2% cut for councils in 2014-15. And as you heard from James Alexander, the leader of York Council there, 60% of the council's budget is on adult social services and children's social services. That's services to keep people in their own homes, helping the vulnerable, the frail elderly, Meals on Wheels, care packages for people. Councils are in an impossible position, and moreover, councils like York that have experienced flooding this year have still not seen a penny that was promised from the government in help on that.
I knew the F word would rear its head at some stage, but Alex Shelby, what would you say to council leaders who say we just haven't got the budget to care for elderly and vulnerable people?
Well, I mean, I don't know what the situation of the books are in York, but I can speak from the city.
Some problems. The risk of snow could stretch as far southeast as London. Certainly, though, at the moment for parts of the Midlands, Wales, northern England, and later in the day through into central and eastern areas of Scotland, there is the threat of some significant snowfall and a risk of disruption. There is some uncertainty about the detail in the forecast at the moment. Please bear with us and get the latest updates wherever you can. Our website's a great place to try, but also on the BBC News channel. Fiona.
Thanks, Susan. It's nearly 6:30. Stay with us. Now it's time to join the BBC's news teams where you are. Bye-bye.
Fiona, thank you. Good evening. You're watching Friday's Look North.
On the programme tonight, the row over the remains of Richard III intensifies. Now, even the King's descendants say he should be buried in York, adding to the growing support in Yorkshire.
There's no doubt about it, the case is definitely swinging behind our county. We've got MPs from cross-party on our side, and even Richard III's descendants are coming out and saying very strongly that he should come back to our great county here and be buried here.
Also tonight, the pensioners feeling the impact of council cuts. A South Yorkshire town plans to withdraw wardens from sheltered housing to save money.
This is why she's here, for this. This is so she can live independent, and to take that away means she probably won't be able to support herself independently.
And stand in line for a seat. The man behind the Full Monty launches a brand new version for the stage.
And it was a fairly cloudy day in Scarborough today. The promise of brighter skies here tomorrow, but what about the rest of Yorkshire? Join me later in the programme.
Now, the row about where the remains of Richard III should finally be laid to rest has intensified today, with some of his own descendants now calling for his remains to be buried in York. Now, you remember the skeleton was found under a car park in Leicester and was died this week.
Well, Krista, both Leicester and York are arguing they are the rightful resting place for the former King of England. Well, now the leader of York Council and the local MP have weighed in, along with more than 15,000 people who have signed an online petition. So what is York's claim to his remains? Well, firstly, there's a strong historical evidence that Richard himself planned to be buried in York Minster. He was prepared to pay 100 priests to pray for his soul. Secondly, Richard spent most of his youth in the north and lived in the Dales at Middleham Castle when he married. And thirdly, he invested in several buildings in York, even paying for defences to be added to Monk Bar. He was buried in haste, naked and anonymous, in a place so cramped his skull was jammed against his shallow grave. Apparently he'd been pierced with a pike, stabbed and hit by an arrow. Hardly his chosen resting place, and yet Leicester now wants him to stay there forever.
Obviously, York wants to shout a little bit and to try and get a bit of attention out of this, but frankly, it won't do them any good, really, because it is a matter now that has been firmly decided, and Richard has been in Leicester for 500 years, and it is in Leicester that he will remain.
Talk like that caused the War of the Roses. In York, Richard III was loved, still is. No pay and display resting place here. He was married in the county at Middleham Castle in North Yorkshire, the Windsor of the North as it was known. Owned Sheriff Hutton Castle and was lordship of Scarborough Castle. That's why the leader of York Council, a stocky Yorkist, James Alexander, is in battle mode.
Well, we say we are continuing and we're fighting this to win. We want to be able to bring these remains back to York, which is where King Richard belongs, and Leicester can back off. It would be a big tourism boost, there's no doubt about that, but this is also about someone's dying wishes. This is where he wanted to be, and this is where the city has great affection for him.
So there you have it. Leicester want him, York most certainly do. And behind me, York Minster have maintained a very dignified silence throughout the whole row. But there's not much doubt that there is a significant momentum building now for Richard III's final resting place to be here in this magnificent building. One of his relatives is in no doubt. We repatriate those who give their lives in battle. So why is this any different? We don't leave them a few miles from where they fell. They are brought home. A point taken up today by MP Julian Sturdy.
We've really got to win this battle now for Richard III, getting back to our great county here. As a proud Yorkshireman, I feel really passionate about this. There's no doubt about it, the case is definitely swinging behind our county. We've got MPs from cross-party on our side, and even Richard III's descendants are coming out and saying very strongly that he should come back to our great county here and be buried here.
2, 1, but the city of Leicester is digging in. Queues today to see the artefacts from the dig, and promises of weekend Richard III breaks. But isn't the issue really where he wanted to rest in peace? Let the battle continue.
Gosh, it's certainly a talking point, isn't it, Harry? Well, the church warden from a lovely church, it's St Helen and the Holy Cross in Sheriff Hutton near York, thinks absolutely he should come home. He's Roy Thompson, and he joins us now. Just before we go into why, who is that behind you, Roy? Tell us who is there in the tomb.
Dudley sped off, hitting Bill Owl, and after that, he did not stop.